Hey there. What's up, everybody? This is Kenneth Thomas from Gnomon. I'm the Gnomon stream operator. Welcome. I'm very excited today that just making sure my audio works. Yes, it looks like it's working. So today, it's very exciting. We've got environment artist Josh Haun with us. He's going to discuss what it takes to build a successful career in game environment art. He's going to share insights from his journey in architecture to creating environments for titles like Call of Duty and many other things that I'm sure you know all about. He's got a degree in architecture, ICAA certification, and he's done a lot of hands-on work in Los Angeles's historical architecture community, which, as you'll find out, is really important for this kind of work. So yeah, you're going to be getting a really cool perspective on this work shaped both by classical theory and real-world design practice. Josh, am I leaving anything? I'm sure there's a lot more I could say, but I figure you could do the talking better than me.
No, that's about it. Thank you, Kenneth. That's wonderful.
All right, then I'm going to hand it over to Josh. I will be quiet, and Josh will start his presentation. Enjoy, everybody. Oh, and I should mention, we will have a little Q&A afterwards. So if there's anything you'd like to know more about, please put your questions in the chat. All right, go to it, Josh. Thanks.
Awesome. So I'd like to start this off just by saying, this presentation, I'm going to be covering a number of topics that are hopefully relevant to artists that are looking to start off working in video games as environment artists, or perhaps artists that are starting off their career and they just want some tips on how to generally be more successful in this business. And then perhaps after this presentation is over, I will be able to give a live demo as well that'll be a little bit more advanced and will cover some of the topics that I've discussed in a previous Gnomon workshop video that I have done that goes into Victorian architecture and some of the principles behind that. But first and foremost, I had started originally in architecture. I was in architecture school, and I'm often asked about this path because it's not as common to go from architecture into video games. Now, there are obvious crossovers, as with environment art, we build a lot of architecture, but for a digital realm for video games, right? But of course, with architecture, you're doing physical models, you're doing drawings, you're doing construction details, and often, architecture school gets quite weird, right? We're often looking at forms purely in their aesthetic sense, and then we often apply those forms into discussions about, okay, how do these visual aesthetics work into real spaces, right? And with video games, we don't have those real-world constraints, but those real-world constraints are important for visual storytelling, right? This scene here, this is a house that I had designed for the Gnomon workshop, and I was able to use a number of architectural principles in designing out this space that feels quite realistic, right? Because emergent designs can kind of come from a hybrid of architecture and of games. So a little bit about my background, I started in community college doing architectural drafting, and I had discovered the Gnomon workshop along with Gnomon's individual online courses, and I was able to utilize a lot of those 3D skills to basically further what I was doing in architecture school. But more importantly, that landed me a job at Infinity Ward, right? I was an art intern on Call of Duty Infinite Warfare, a game that had come out in 2016. Since then, I've worked on a number of other Call of Duty games, including Modern Warfare, Warzone, Modern Warfare 2, the 2020 version of Modern Warfare 2 at least. And then later in my career, I went on to work at Riot Games on VALORANT maps. Now, while I was doing these game jobs, I was also doing a bachelor's in architecture, just taking online classes to basically complete that degree. And now I work at a company called Elsewhere Entertainment. We are doing a unannounced project. This is a company that's under Activision, and what we are doing I am quite excited about because it is effectively a narrative-based, genre-defining AAA game project. But in my whole experience here, I want to basically draw attention especially to the Gnomon workshop and how important that was to me, because through the workshop and then later through taking individual courses, I was introduced to my mentor, Devin Fay, who really got me into the video games industry and made my whole career kind of happen, right? And going through this whole process, I broke down some of the main principles that I learned into a number of skills, right? So as I was just saying, my mentor, he was basically able to help me get into the games business. And that is especially important because social connections are at the core of everything that you do in games, right? The connections that you make, the people that you meet, networking, all of that is not only going to help you get jobs, it is going to put your resume in front of recruiters. And most importantly, those connections that you build in this business are going to lead to many projects later down the line and some great friendships. So at the core of everything, right? No matter all the skills that we discuss, the absolute wrapper around everything is the people that you meet and the importance of keeping those relationships going, right? But in terms of the more substantial skills that are kind of outside the realm of kind of nebulous social interactions, you've got the foundational 3D skills. Now, generally what happens when most people, especially in architecture, ask me about, okay, how do I get into video games? They're kind of coming from a background of using tools like AutoCAD or Autodesk Revit or Fusion 360 all the time. And these are, with the exception of Fusion 360 at least, these are tools that aren't really used in game dev. So the number one probably foundational skill to kind of build up to get into games, especially in environment art, is learning tools like Photoshop, Substance Painter, Blender, and Maya, right? These are the main tools that environment artists use every day to accomplish the task and to build out video game environments. And there are many ways to learn these tools, right? Perhaps one of the best, at least in my opinion, not to come off like I'm totally shilling, but I personally got a lot of value out of the Gnomon workshop, especially 10 years, well, more than 10 years ago when I first started in this business. The Gnomon workshop was one of the few resources available to teach 3D, but nowadays, of course, we have an infinite amount of tutorials, especially for Blender on YouTube, right? This remains one of the best locations to just learn as much as possible, especially for free, right? YouTube is great for that reason, especially to kind of try out ideas and to kind of see if you do indeed like things like 3D modeling, right? And when you start to learn these tools, you'll find that starting small is the key, right? It's the key to building up everything. So 3D environments, they always start with an individual prop, right? In this case, I have this little cashier, right? Rather basic prop, nothing too special about it. But this one prop can be like the seed that germinates the rest of a environment art scene, right? You'll take a prop, you'll model it in a tool like Blender or Maya, you'll texture it in Substance Painter, right? And then that will eventually turn into a larger scene as you build out everything. So you can see here, this is an Art Deco diner I built back in 2020. This was a personal project. And that same little cashier, this little cash register, right? That little piece became this sort of focal point as a prop for the rest of the scene. And that one small project turned into something much bigger, right? But of course, you don't always start with individual props only. Artists almost always start out in a sort of block out simple mode, right? In this case, I had drawn architectural plans for this Art Deco diner that I had done, basically elevations, floor plan, and then a 3D blockout. Now, often most artists just do a 3D blockout, which is perfectly fine. That's more of the standard. And with these 3D blockouts, you are trying to get a sense of what the scene is going to be before you spend all this time working on it. But of course, once you are satisfied with a blockout, you get into cool levels of detail, which is one of the fun things about environment art, right? Take, for instance, the floors of my diner. These are terrazzo floors that I had drawn in 2D, broke those 2D images out into masks, right? These red, green, and blue ugly looking images here on the bottom left. And those became ways to control the amount of different colors of terrazzo I was using on this floor, right? So there's this sense of combining 2D and 3D workflows together to build something grander. Another workflow that I had used to start off this process was photo scanning, right? Photo scanning, otherwise known as photogrammetry, is taking hundreds, sometimes thousands of photos of an individual object, usually with an overcast lighting condition, so you can get really flat textures, combining all of those together and building out, letting the computer process for you a one-to-one replication, full-on archaeological museum archival quality model of a real-life object, right? And then when you have objects like this, they're a great way to build out reference, both in scale and in texture, to then start a 3D scene, which I was able to do, again, with the diner. And then finally, when you're doing these 3D scenes, at least in my case, I put a lot of emphasis on putting my time and energy into key hero assets. And when I use terms like hero asset, that refers to an object that gains more importance than other objects. So that little cash register that I did earlier, that was a simple prop, only took maybe a couple hours to make, didn't put much effort into it. But things like these cars or the central sculptural piece of the drive-in, these things I had sculpted, right? I'd spent a lot of time modeling these out and making sure these key assets were way more important than anything else. And then when everything combines together, this was the final image, right? This noir kind of dark, shadowy drive-in, something that reminds you of 1930s movies in Los Angeles, right? And all of this together itself was inspired by a book, a Raymond Chandler novel, because that is a very notable author that writes a lot in Los Angeles. So kind of all these things can come together and be part of an environment artist's workflow, right? You've got narrative, you've got story, you have different artistic workflows, and all of these pieces come together to build a full finished environment. Now, when it comes to workflows too, I don't think there's always one key way of doing things. I like to try to mix different workflows together to get something that is unique, right? And the different workflows that you use, the combinations, that is ultimately what creates a lot of the creativity and what leads to something new, being able to use different tools. So you often hear many professionals say that you should only be using Maya, right? You should be using Maya instead of Blender. And my reaction to that is that it's false, right? Use what you want to work on. Use the tool that best fits what your goal is, right? And if that tool is something like Blender, which I think a lot of the time Blender is a superior tool than even Maya these days, it is the tool to use for you, right? And here's kind of why I think that. When you look at video games, I want to break this down for you. So video games exist on the engine level, but a lot of the assets are made on the DCC level, right? So DCC is going to be your 3D modeling tool. It's going to be the tool that you use to create your art assets. And then the engine layer, that would be like Unreal Engine or Unity or Source or whatever other engine that you decide to use for the video game that you're working on. Those engines are the final destination of your video game assets, the models that you create for your big environment. So because of that, it doesn't matter what tool you use to get into these engines. What matters in the end is the engine. That's the most important aspect, right? So most companies, right, most big studios will say, okay, we want you to use Maya because we've spent, years and years and years having our programmers build tools to take models from Maya into whatever game engine that video game studio is using, right? But here's the kicker, right? Blender can just send objects straight to Maya. So if you're one of those people that don't want to get into spending tons of money on buying Maya and learning it, just get Blender, learn how to use it, and you can always load your Blender models into Maya to then send into a video game engine, therefore killing the whole argument that you need to know Maya. Now, there are some exceptions to this. If you are somebody that's like obsessed with like Naughty Dog games, for instance, or Sony Santa Monica games, for instance, right? Like God of War, right? That'd be a Sony game. They often use Maya as the editor for their engine in this weird way. So yeah, if your goal is to work at one of those companies, learn Maya. But otherwise, focus on getting your art done in a way that works for your workflow, right? And then with that in mind, you'll have some of the foundational skills to build up your career. Now, with that in mind, there's another step up from that with the foundational skills in place. The second most important factor and being able to succeed in games, especially to get a job and whatnot, is prior work experience, right? Now, video games, degrees do not matter, right? Like I've interviewed a lot of people, I've hired or I've been part of panels that have hired artists. We almost never look at degrees, right? It's not that important. Degrees do help artists learn the skills that we want to see, but if you can learn those skills without a degree, that's perfectly acceptable, right? We prioritize work experience. And part of the reason why is because of the workflows, right? So one of the first things that when I first got a job in games more than a decade ago, I didn't know I didn't know much going in, right? And one of the things I didn't know about was how we handle files. If you imagine you're working on a team, making a video game with potentially hundreds of people all in that game, there's this question of, okay, how do you manage files, right? And files, they need to be resolved because you are exchanging files across hundreds of people in real time. And the tool that we use for that is called Perforce. And this is a tool that basically takes your individual files that you are working on, it locks them so only you can edit them, and then those files are going to be uploaded, kind of imagine to like a cloud or a server, and then it's shared with all the other people on your team. So there's this constant sense that you're working in real time amongst other people, right? So being able to know how to use Perforce, being able to know that this is how you manage things is part of the work experience that developers like myself might look for when we're hiring people, right? We care about things like with Perforce, it's very easy to, add a file into the game engine that breaks everything, and then the programmers might have to spend tens of hours fixing your mistake, right? So it's always important to check your files, make sure they work, look for things that could potentially cause errors and try to avoid them. Be very detail oriented with what you add to a video game engine. A lot of the time, artists might come into a project, new artists, and they have no idea that they need to be this careful, and they're just checking whatever they want into the file system for a game engine, and it's not good. They can get into a lot of trouble. But artists who pay a lot of attention to what files that they're modifying, checking names, make sure the files are named correctly, just doing general stuff like file cleanliness or testing testing the change they made to a game by playing it, those skills and that level of etiquette is going to help you succeed and not mess up. Now, to keep track of all of these files, right? Because if you imagine there are hundreds of game developers on a video game and there are thousands, maybe millions of files being modified in real time, that's a lot, right? And it gets unwieldy quick, which is why we have something called the production department. And this is something I did not know about going into games, but I very quickly learned that, okay, production is extremely important because the production, AKA producers, people with the producer title, often they come out of like QA, for instance. These producers, they are managing multiple team members. They are looking at, what tasks are being tracked across the game. They are looking at scheduling, and they do all of this through something called the Agile workflow, which is pretty much straight up the Scrum episode from Silicon Valley, right? It's this idea that all tasks are being tracked as these sort of little notes, right? In the case of Silicon Valley, they track all of their little tasks they have for the engineers on Post-it notes. And all of these tasks are then categorized into like, oh, it's in progress or it's done, right? And of course, today, we don't use Post-it notes, but we do use a program called Jira, right? And it's not a particularly hard program to learn or anything. Jira is just like a website for tracking stuff. It's important, though, to know that tracking your tasks, tracking the amount of time it takes you to do something, that's very important because it's going to allow the producers to assign you your tasks correctly, to make sure that the tasks that you're doing correspond with stuff that other people are doing and whatnot. And additionally, what will happen is video games budgets are calculated on how many Jira tasks are being completed in many cases, right? So if you're working on a game, right, or you're doing like a startup company, your funding might be dependent in some cases upon how many Jira tasks that your team is completing on a quarterly basis. Therefore, your success as an artist greatly depends on your ability to keep track of your tasks, keep track of how long they take you to do, and to organize your time efficiently, right? These seem like basic skills to have, but they absolutely have an impact on your ability to succeed in the industry. Now, another factor that's also super important for environments and artists especially is being able to work with the design team and the concept team. Now, the design team, they are usually level designers, right? And level designers, their goal is to do either 2D top-down views of the maps that might later become video game levels, and sometimes they might do 3D blockouts with like these very basic blocky shapes of what they expect a video game level to be later on. And the designers usually have the authority because they are focused more on gameplay, whereas an artist, your goal is more focused on the aesthetics, right? So being able to take a level designer's blockout and then turn that into art is extremely important, and concept artists will help you in that process. Now, these are some screenshots of a Riot Games video on YouTube. There is me on the right, our principal artist, Brandon, and then our lead level designer, Joe. We're all looking at one of the maps. This is Pearl. And the process starts with the level designer. He comes out with a very basic block out of what a Valorant map might look like, and all the level designers would play test it. They would try the map over and over and over again to look for issues, look for like competitive problems with the map design. And when they like the overall block out, they will then have concept team do paint overs, and the concept people, they will do 2D paintings of what they expect that map to look like given the designer's block out, right? So you might have a finished map like this one, at least the layout's finished, right? And then myself or other environment artists will then have to take this map to a final level of artistic quality based off of the paint overs from the concept artist and the block out from level design. When all of that is said and done, the project will then go to the lighting team or an audio team or a VFX team to do like final polish on the map, right? So in the case of the Valorant Pearl map, the image here, the basic one, is the block out done by Joe Lansford, an amazing level designer. This is a photo by one of my colleagues, Kevin Brunt, who also did a lot of the materials. So those guys were excellent to work with, great people. And then here at the bottom is a paint over by the concept artist at the time, Theo, amazing concept artist, brilliant painter. And they gave me these resources to then go in, and I had to turn that into a real map, right? I did all of the 3D modeling and built this specific map off of the concept and the block out. And you'll see with this block out, the overall shapes rather nicely match with the overall shapes in the final art, right? Of course, all the curves and whatnot are not in the block out. Blockouts are not detailed. They just need to have the main shapes that have an impact on gameplay, right? So all of this together, being able to work with these different roles, that all contributes to prior work experience. And that is why we value prior work experience so highly, because of those people that we work with and being able to function within that sort of a team environment. And that leads me into soft skills, which have a huge impact on your ability to get hired or your ability to succeed in games, right? Like I've even been in interviews where I've interviewed people, and often the people that come out getting a job are the people that were more positive in an interview, right? Like socially, they were very upbeat. We had a really good rapport with them. And perhaps, maybe their portfolio isn't good as somebody else, but if their social skills are better, that can land them a job. And the reason why we put so much emphasis on these soft skills like communication or leadership is because games are inherently team projects. Now, if you think about movies, there's this concept in movies called auteur theory, which is this idea that the director has sole control over the vision of a project, right? So if you think about great directors throughout history that had very specific individual visions, that is because they had control of things like Final Cut. They had the ability to edit the movie to exactly how they wanted to. They had control over every single scene in the movie, and the director could manage almost everything. And that is inherent to the technology of filmmaking, right? But video games work differently. Because we work in video game engines, we don't have that ability for individual directors to micromanage every part of a project. There are some exceptions to this, right? Like some indie games might, be a little bit closer to like the auteur theory of film production, where you can have individual indie developers having more control over a project. Or Kojima's another example, where he's somebody who in the Kojima games, he has amazing directorial control over the whole project. But those are rare exceptions. Most games are done by huge amounts of people, and therefore teamwork and communication skills are prioritized very highly, right? And all of that together leads into how we break up roles as artists, right? So when you first start as an artist at a games company, you're going to either start as an intern or associate artist in most cases, right? These are entry-level roles. And then from there, you'll get promoted into an artist. Artists at some studios are broken down into 3 categories, 1, 2, and 3. Then there is senior artist, and senior artists are broken down into 1, 2, and 3 in some cases as well. And then there is expert artist, right? And these ranks are important because they were solving a problem that existed for many years. When I first started in the games business, we didn't have all of these like 1, 2, and 3 roles, right? We didn't even have expert artist at the time. We just had artist and senior artist, and that was it. And your seniority at a company was widely different, right? Like you could have a senior artist who was way more senior than another senior artist, and it was like kind of your role didn't track that. It was just sort of like this intuitive thing that you had to figure out who had seniority. So over time, game companies added all of these categories to help give individual roles a little bit more impact on the project, right? And then after you get to expert artist, sometimes at the end of senior artist, you'll get promoted to an art lead or a principal artist. And the distinction here is important because art leads are bosses. They manage people, right? Part of their goal is to spend less time making art and more time managing people. So generally, art leads have to have tremendous people skills to be able to manage the people on their team and make sure that all of the artists working underneath them are getting their tasks done. Meanwhile, a principal artist role is for people that are a little bit maybe less social, right? They want to spend their time in the office just working on art. They're a master artist. They are the top of the top, right? But they don't want to be managing people, so they get promoted into principal artist instead, where they get to have massive control over the artistic style of a game and implementation of that style, right? Now, there's one more role that many people often try to get to in their career, and that is art director. And generally, you get to art director after being an art lead. Sometimes you can go from principal to art director, but I've seen it more often. You go from art lead to art director, and art director, you're the big boss, right? You get to have massive control over a whole project. And the kicker to all of this is that your ability to be promoted on a project is often based on your ability to work well with others, right? You're not going to rank up in games if you are not somebody who is, you need to be always having like a good team spirit. You need to be working with other people. You need to be communicating well with others if you want to get promoted. Because, like I said earlier, this whole industry is so team dependent that social ability is often what leads to and what helps you rank up between all of these roles and eventually make your way up to an art lead or art director, right? So with that in mind, these are like kind of the three key foundational levels I think that are kind of required to get jobs in games or to rank up. It's foundational art skills. It is prior work experience. It is like your soft communication skills. But there are a few other things that you can do as well that are like little, kind of like frosting right on a cake, little things that you can do to just edge out a little bit over the competition. One of the most important of those is artistic skills, right? Knowledge of what good composition is or what beautiful means. And you can really get into the key of that when you look at classical paintings, right? This is the Death of Socrates, a 18th century painting, beautiful. But you'll see that, no matter the orientation of the painting, you can have these like spiral overlays on it, which govern how the image is composed. And composed means it's like how you block the scene, where you put your people, where you put the environmental details, where you draw the focus of an individual's eye, right? When you see a painting, what's the first thing you look at? All of these contribute to the idea of beauty, and generally, in a lot of cases, not always, but in many cases, they follow this spiral pattern, which you might have seen. It is the golden ratio, otherwise known as the Fibonacci sequence, and so on and so forth. It is a classical symbol that came out of Greek design from, thousands and thousands of years ago, right? This compositional pattern was discovered a long time ago, was important then, still important now, and it often governs what is beautiful, right? Famously, I'm sure many of you have seen the image of the Vitruvian Man by Da Vinci. And the Vitruvian Man itself follows the compositional elements of a pentagram, right? And a pentagram is basically just a pentagon with connected points to make a star, and you can put an infinite amount of pentagons inside this pentagon, right? Like you'll see here, you have a pentagram here, and then inside the pentagon that gets spawned at the center of this shape, you have another one. And you can do this indefinitely, forever. It's an infinite pattern. In the same way that these spirals can spiral indefinitely forever, right? And this is seen in nature all the time, right? Shells have the spirals. Flowers often have the five-sided symmetry into pentagon shapes. Trees bifurcate, basically meaning split apart in patterns that are based on this image here. This is the phi scale, this triangle. And basically this phi scale I go over a lot in my Gnomon workshop talk. I talk about how to build this shape and how to construct these divisions, because these divisions are also infinite. They will go on indefinitely and they will never stop. And they follow the same mathematical ratio of the pentagon and the golden spiral, right? That is called A plus B divided by B equals A divided by B equals phi. Phi is the Greek letter for this specific ratio, right? Now, there's a lot of talk as to why this shape is found so often in nature. Some people I've heard say that this is the optimal mathematical pattern for the concept of biological growth, right? Which was formed by millions of years of evolution. Some people say that this is a sign of God. Other people say that this is perhaps a combination of those things, right? But the point of it is that we can use this shape to govern how we do designs. In architecture, it doesn't matter if it's a classical building or Victorian buildings or ancient buildings, you'll see these shapes governing how you divide your buildings. Now, two great books that kind of get into the aesthetics of these shapes are one, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. It is a masterpiece, incredible book written in 1974 about the nature of aesthetics. There's a lot of philosophy discussed in this book about why things are beautiful, why things have quality and others don't. And then there is the book Beauty, Memory, Unity by Steve Bass, a more recent book that talks about how do we construct these shapes, where do we see them in architecture. It's a little bit more technical, but has a lot of pictures and is a great artistic reference. Now, with that said, this is a rather technical way to get to something that is beautiful. But often people make beautiful things without going to all these subdivisions. And that is why photography is so important as an environment artist. I do a lot of photography. These are various pictures I've taken from around the world. And when I compose these images, I kind of try to do it intuitively. I kind of try to think, okay, I'm not using these diagrams to construct the perfect composition. I am trying to intuitively find those compositions in nature. And looking through a camera viewfinder will help you do that. Painting is another way of doing this. So is drawing. Photography is usually the most approachable, though, and therefore I highly recommend it for any environment artist who wants to succeed. Get into photography. It's extremely important. It will teach you how to intuitively look for beautiful shapes in nature and will therefore help the beauty of your artistic environments. I personally shoot on a Pentax K1 with a full frame sensor because I like a heavier camera, right? I want my cameras to feel like I'm doing, 50-pound bicep curls because it helps me with image stabilization. And, I also just like the weightiness of a camera. It feels well balanced, right? But some people like Sony mirrorless cameras, which are much smaller, much lighter, but they feel a little bit unbalanced. So I don't like using them. But, personal preference there. All of these cameras will get you beautiful images, much better than what you're going to be able to take with a smartphone. Plus, even if you could take a great picture on a smartphone, some people do on like new iPhones, for instance, the only way you're going to get that true, framing of a composition is by looking through a camera viewfinder. And because like when you look through a camera viewfinder, you look through the camera lens, it blocks out everything around you and you're truly focused on the composition, no distractions. Therefore, DSLR, mirrorless cameras, get one and it will help you be a better environment artist. Now, the next step kind of that you can use to get your skills a little bit higher is specialty skills, right? And specialty skills would be things like artistic style, right? So being able to do stylized art could put you, a step ahead of others when you're trying to work at a certain company, but it's not as important as the other steps. And I say this because I had never done a stylized piece of art before working at Riot. I had only done like realistic style pieces of art, but I still got hired nonetheless, and I was able to work on VALORANT and do stylized art, right? So yes, specializing your skills are important, but they are not the end-all be-all of getting a job and succeeding in game development, right? They will only just help you edge out over others a little bit. So it's something to keep in mind, but not something to spend a lot of time focusing on, right? If you do want to focus on it, though, there are some things that you can do. Photogrammetry is one of them. This is an environment I worked on with my team at Infinity Ward. Brilliant artists over there at Infinity Ward, some of the best guys I've ever had the pleasure of working with. And we put together this scanned environment for Modern Warfare 2, right? This is a church in Amsterdam, and we did it via photogrammetry, right? We had been able to capture a ton of images and then build out a scanned replica of this church, right? The quality is incredible that you can get with these scanned assets. And that is all part of the photogrammetry workflow. There's a program called Reality Capture that is often used to process all of these images into 3D models. And it is a skill that you can pick up and try to learn if this is a style of workflow that you like the look of or want to try out for yourself, right? Up close, you get all these nice details. But here's the thing. All of these assets that you create with photogrammetry come out as these extremely high resolution meshes that are not performant for video game engines, right? You're going to lag out the game if you just use all of this data. So a big part of learning how to use photogrammetry is not just learning how to scan with a camera, but it's being able to break down props and models into individual elements, right? So if you look at here, the areas highlighted in red are parts where I converted 3D scans into 2D textures. And those textures are then applied over and over again across an object to save performance. Same thing in the area highlighted in blue here. This one is just a flat texture that I applied on this wall. But this column, or rather this pilaster right here in orange, this is a individual model that I had been able to, I think this one we actually had, I don't remember if I did this model or not. This might have been another team member. There was a lot of crossover, but the idea is that with this piece, this was a direct 3D model from a scan, right? And we optimize it down and make it more performant. So with all of this in mind, you know, you'll take the church, right? The image on the left is a photograph that I had taken, and the image on the right is the Call of Duty asset. And it looks rather similar, very, very accurate. And that is like the power of this new technology that's come online in the last, decade or so. So with all that in mind, there's one more skill here that is somewhat important, but not nearly as much as it used to be: presentation skills, right? So often when artists are trying to get a job, they have a hard time getting noticed by a recruiter because, especially if a AAA game company puts up a job posting, thousands of people apply. And often, unfortunately, many of these applications are often not real applications. Many of them are scams or phishing attempts. So part of a recruiter's job is to filter through and find quality applicants, right? But that makes it more important than ever for you as an artist to need to stand out, right? So I quite like to see large complete environments with photographic compositions and dramatic lighting because they are eye-catching, right? If a recruiter is looking at thousands of applications a day, they're only going to focus on the ones that catch their eye. So doing a full environment, doesn't matter if it's non-performant, doesn't matter if it's not optimized. When you're just trying to get a job, go for whatever looks the best, and you'll have a higher chance of getting a recruiter's attention. And from there, you can perhaps get an interview and then land a job, right? But if you're always focused on making your personal projects like super performant, adding LODs, making them function and be playable like you would in a real game environment, you're just wasting your time because you don't need to do optimizations or performance for something that you're just showing to somebody else. You need to do optimization and performance for real games when you have a job later. Also, often you might hear the advice to gear your portfolio to one studio, right? So let's say, for example, you're a fan of World of Warcraft and you want to go and work at Blizzard, right? So you make a portfolio full of stuff that looks like Blizzard art, right? You might think, okay, that's a great idea to get hired, but what if you don't get hired, right? You've just suddenly spent potentially months working on art assets for a specific game. Therefore, I always recommend people, like, unless you are 100% a fanboy of a company and you have to work there, make a portfolio that is more wide so you can apply to more companies, and good artists will be able to look at your portfolio and say, okay, I see you're not necessarily doing our style, but we see you have artistic skills, therefore we're going to hire you, right? So lastly on this, I do not recommend people to spend all of their time making one individual prop, right? Often people, I'll see this when I'm interviewing people, right? Applicants will come in and they will say, okay, here's a bunch of props that I made. And sure, they are, looking really good, but I'd rather see a full environment than individual props. And I want those full environments to look good as opposed to, being technically modeled the right way. So with all that said, one rule of thumb that's important to keep in mind in the games business is that if you have 2 shipped games plus 5 years of experience at a studio, you're going to have a much better chance of getting an interview somewhere. Now, all of that said, we get into the topic of portfolios. And ArtStation has kind of killed the need for individual portfolios. Like almost everybody now just puts all of their stuff on ArtStation and treats it like social media. And therefore, when I see applications, that's generally what I get, right? Is ArtStation posts. which is fine. You can make individual portfolios if you so desire. I have done that on my portfolio. Sites like Squarespace or whatever can be great if you want to have an individual portfolio, but it's not needed. Only do it if you want to. I don't think it's particularly going to help you with the job application. This is truly something that is up to yourself, right? So all of that together, and those are some of the main things to keep in mind. Now, with all of that said, there's an important issue. Maybe it's not an issue, but it's a trend that I've noticed recently, and it's led to me making a lot of art decisions. And that is that games in the last 5 years with notable art, they all have something in common, right? And if you look at all of these games, they all have styles of art that reference the past, right? These are all games that have like fantasy style art, right? With the exception of Cyberpunk, or at least you might think there's an exception for Cyberpunk, right? Because it's sci-fi, but really Cyberpunk is more retro 80s than it is sci-fi, therefore it's a style that references the past, right? So all of these together have so much emphasis on prior art that came from previous points in history almost. Therefore, I've started to look at environment art as sort of archaeology. Environment artists spend a lot of the time referencing the past and focusing on the past, right? So one of the big reasons that we've had why I'm seeing like a shift as environment artists becoming more like archaeologists is because of what's happened with reference. Now, when I started 10 years ago, most art reference was kind of sorted in inconsistent ways at different companies. Reference would be based on searches from the internet, or it was not organized properly, or if it was organized, it took the 80s a lot of extra time to do so. They don't want to be doing that as often with their time. So reference was just like a problem, right? It was always kind of an annoyance until Miro. Miro's a free website that has come online rather recently, where you can put all of your reference into a single board and share it with team members. And I have seen so many studios switch to Miro for their reference. It is becoming massive, right? Miro is huge. And the reason why Miro is so huge is because it lets artists kind of organize all of their reference pieces into one location that other people can also see in real time, and they can collaborate on reference images together. So I've seen, wiki articles on Miro. I've seen book excerpts. I've seen historical documents, videos, and photos. Environment artists are referencing all these points of media that aren't just images, but vastly different types of media from all parts of the world coming together to help give reference to an environment and make that environment way more genuine than it otherwise may be. So with that in mind, I'm going to show you a Miro board that I had used for the Queen Anne Victorian house that I did for the Gnomon workshop. So this is a Miro board, right? All my images are right here, all together in this nice area, right? And kind of what you'll see here is that you can put a lot. You can have arrows. You can do all sorts of, there we go. You can have text. You can do individual callouts on your reference, and it's all pretty clean, right? I can move stuff around easily. And it's given the artist a lot of power to reference history, right? To kind of be that archaeological role. So this is like my bookshelf, for instance, one of my mini bookshelves, and I have quite a books here. This one in the middle, these sections of books in the middle here, these are the Princeton Architectural Series, one of the best resources for architectural details that I've found. These books are just full of tons of diagrams on architecture from centuries, right? We have Egypt, we have parks across the United States, we have pavilions in Rome, there are townhouses in France, all just documented in these incredible series of architecture pieces. Additionally, on the side, I've taken up a lot of classes with the ICAA. Now, if you are in the United States, I highly recommend checking out the ICAA. They are a nonprofit organization that continues to teach classical architectural precedents, right? They are very rigorous on what they teach. And if you take a lot of their courses, they do online and in-person classes across the United States, you will come away with an incredible knowledge of classical architecture. You'll be able to apply this level of archaeological, genuine design to your video game environments, right? So just various things that I've worked on over there is just drafting pavilions, drafting classical moldings, drafting classical entablatures, and there's so much emphasis on the past on how they built these types of components, right? If you look at these columns, these are Tuscan columns that I had made in Unreal, just as a side personal project. And the proportions here are exactly perfect to what you'll find in classical architecture, to a T, because I had started with drawings that were based on a book called The American Vignola, which is the true way to proportion these classical details. Now, these drawings here are Doric. These ones are Tuscan. So the Tuscan, they're a little bit more squat, so they're not as tall as my diagrams here on the left, these 2D ones. But I just made that modification for the Tuscan order, right? And then I went in and I did some aging in Unreal to get something that looks like it could be from like a classical painting, at least for these columns, right? And that was one of the pieces that I had started with when I was doing my Victorian house. But of course, with the Victorian house that I did from the Gnomon workshop, I had done a tremendous amount of research on the Renaissance architecture, on Gothic architecture, going all the way into the Queen Anne mode of design, which had a huge emphasis on Victorian architecture in America. And eventually we make our way to classical details in Victorian design. And in some of these, I will be showing you in a moment of what I did in Unreal. But one more note here. I highly recommend people, this is something that people often forget, is if you live in a city, not even if you live in a city, if you live anywhere in the world, there are probably beautiful environments, beautiful pieces of architecture for you to explore if you go out of your way to find them. This is Pasadena in California. This is a historical museum. You can just go here and you can take pictures of these beautiful Victorian houses, and you can get a sense of what this style of architecture feels like in person. You can take architecture tours in places like Carroll Avenue in Los Angeles to see even more Victorians. You can go down to Oak Park in Chicago, see some great things. You can go to Hudson River Valley in New York, Long Island in New York, even theme parks or places like Efteling in the Netherlands. These are all locations where you're going to see incredible art. So I really want to impart upon people that if you go outside, if you take architectural tours, if you do photography out at notable locations, you're going to build up this incredible vocabulary of architectural forms and great details. Now, with that said, I'm going to transition to Unreal 5 to show you a little bit of what I've been able to work on with these pieces of architectural archaeology. So give me a few minutes here for Unreal 5 to load. If you'd like to take a break, now's a good time to do so.
Yeah, this is great so far. I hope everyone else is enjoying it as much as I am, for sure. And I just want to remind folks to definitely ask questions in the chat while Josh starts up Unreal, because, like I said, there's a Gnomon Workshop discount code, as well as a free annual subscription that we are offering to one lucky viewer and question asker. But you have to ask a question in order to be considered for the annual subscription. And yeah, I know I've got some questions. I love hearing about all the architecture and art history stuff. That's super huge. I'm really glad you're talking about that.
Yeah, sorry for the delay for the people at home here.
Oh, that's okay.
It always takes a while to open, especially for these large scenes, right?
Yeah, I think everyone who works or studies this type of stuff knows inherently that it takes a long time to open up software. for sure. Oh yeah, there's definitely some good questions in the chat. So, and I'm definitely logging them, and we'll try to get to all the questions if we can at the end of the presentation.
Yes, and perhaps I'd like to try to wrap up my presentation maybe 30 minutes from now, if that works, and then there'd be a good solid 30 minutes for questions.
Perfect. That works for me. And so yeah, 30 more minutes, and then 30 more minutes after that for questions and answers. And actually, while you're opening that up, here's a can I ask you one question right now? Should be
Yeah, absolutely.
okay. So WUOTE asks, favorite book you recommend everyone to read? Probably in regards to this sort of architectural and environmental work you're doing.
Yes, for architectural work, the best possible book to read is a book called A Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander.
Mm.
It is a book written in the 1970s that actually inspired Wikipedia. Wikipedia would not exist if this book didn't come out in the 70s first. A lot of programmers actually read it and then made Wikipedia, but it started as an architectural book. And the concept is that you have hundreds of patterns, little short patterns. A pattern is basically an architectural idea, right? We call that a pattern. And all of those hundreds and hundreds of patterns in this book, right? It'll be things like, there'll be like 2-3 paragraphs on why it's important to make thick walls, or a couple paragraphs on the beauty of alcoves in an interior space. Perhaps a pattern on how to lay out parts of a city, right? So in that book, A Pattern Language, amazing to read. And then in regards to, I'd also like to give a recommendation for books if you're just a fan of video games, if you're a gamer. 2 books for that. The first book is it's a series, The Hyperion Cantos by Dan Simmons. It is a book that inspired Mass Effect. The Mass Effect series was greatly inspired by this book. It's a sci-fi novel, incredible, very well written. A lot of classical art is referenced in this book too. Went on to inspire a lot of sci-fi in video games. And then for other video games, many of them have been inspired by the book Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. If you think about Cyberpunk Phantom Liberty, the DLC for Cyberpunk, that was heavily inspired by Heart of Darkness. The movie Apocalypse Now, inspired by it. Far Cry 2, that video game, if any of you guys remember that, inspired by this book. So those 2 books, incredible to read. You'll find a lot of ideas from those books referenced in many, many video game stories.
Good. Great. Yeah, great suggestions. Definitely Heart of Darkness for sure. Because I come from more of a cinema background, cinema history background, and you're right about Heart of Darkness. That influenced so much. Yeah. Apocalypse Now being the most obvious example.
Yeah, but you see its DNA everywhere in like all these different movies, right? So it's like, even if you're not a huge fan of the story necessarily, I know some people aren't, it's worth reading just for the reference that it's had on media for over a century.
Yeah, for sure.
But I should have this available now. So
Okay.
I can go ahead and share Unreal and continue.
Yeah, when you share it all.
I'd like to try to, if I have time, I'm going to try to go through this Unreal stuff fast to give you guys like a quick modeling tutorial. I had a little bit more modeling stuff prepared, but I don't know if we have time to get into all of that. So I'll try to go fast through Unreal so I have a little bit of time left over just to show a little bit of my 3D modeling process, because it is a little bit different. Cool. And if you guys are interested in the 3D modeling that I'm showing, my workshop has a significant amount more.
Sounds good. All right, let me turn that on, and there you go.
So here is my Victorian house. This is a Queen Anne Victorian in Unreal. And all the architectural details here are referenced from classical patterns that were relevant at the time, right? There was a lot of research and study I did to make sure that this feels genuine. One of the big things that you'll notice, at least at front, other than, sorry, you're going to see weird artifacting in the background. I recently updated Unreal to the new version, and it broke a lot of my trees. These are all speed tree meshes, and they're a little bit busted in the new version. But back when I made this model was in an older version of Unreal, so some things are going to be broken. But that said, This house is designed based on the concept of two approaches, which is important in Victorian architecture because in the Victorian mode, there is a sense of the public and there is a sense of the private. Now, the public would basically be how others interpret your living situation, others interpret your house, and you want to present to the public your best foot forward. You want to make what is at the front of the house geared 100% to the guest, right? You're going to put yourself second to the guest. So you will have a beautiful approach, usually with a nice gate, flowers, a nice walk through a lawn leading up to a house, and that'll be how guests enter your home. But at this time, a lot of the people who were building these Victorian houses, it was a high upper level middle class, right? Like think of engineers, lawyers, and doctors at the turn of the century, going from the 1900s into the 20th century, right? And the growing financial class at that time had the money for servants, right? They also had the money for a lot of kids, big families. So generally with a lot of these homes, you have a secondary entrance, usually with like a larger gate for carriages and whatnot. And this would be more of an approach to the house to a secondary entry that you would reserve for the family and for the servants that would work for you if you're like the head of the house, for instance. In this case, I have a porte cochere being a covered component on which a car or a wagon can go underneath and then directly into a doorway. So I'm going to turn off lighting because it's rather dark here. You'll see I have a doorway right there coming in from the porte cochere, right? And there's two approaches to how I design this space, right? On the side of the approach for guests, the design is more classically beautiful. And on the approach for the family and for the servants, it is more naturalistic with these hanging lanterns that give a sense of mystery, forebodingness, and adventure, right? And this is the picturesque versus the beautiful. This is a common idea you see in classical art. And I have to like two little diagrams prepared over here to show you what I mean. This is the beautiful. This is an axial direction, right? This comes out of French gardening a lot. So you'll see this at places like Versailles, right? Where you have these axial orientations and all of your trees are well pruned. You do a lot of Italian cypresses. You do trees like crepe myrtles that look beautiful and that look clean. There's a sense of cleanliness and orderliness, and this is the beautiful, right? Then there is the method of English gardening. This comes out of England in the, I believe, 18th and 19th centuries. And this picturesque is all about limiting the amount of man's effects on nature. You want nature to appear as if it was made by natural components alone and man had no role. This was very popular in English gardens, right? Even though English gardeners, they spent thousands of hours pruning the trees to make them look like they were not pruned. It's kind of hilarious, right? So they'll do things like they'll plant a lot of willow trees because they have these beautiful drooping picturesque branches going down into water, right? They spend a lot of time doing clusters of foliage, right? So this idea of you plant big trees in the back, you plant medium trees in the middle, you plant tiny little bushes in the front with some rocks, right? And that sense of hierarchical placement of foliage is what gives the picturesque a sense of being found in nature, right? Like obviously nature is not going to be this perfect of giving you an orientation. Nature is going to be random, but you almost make something the goal is to make it feel so natural, so realistic that it becomes more natural than nature itself. And that is very careful placement and clustering of all of your plants, right? They also like little scenes like this where you might have a column, right? Generally in architecture, columns or pavilions or pediments in a garden environment will be called follies. In this case, this little folly looks like it's kind of ruins. They love ruined stuff in the English gardens, right? So any way to make a garden feel natural, it's going to help with the picturesque. And Victorian did both, right? Some styles of architecture go picturesque or they go beautiful. It's one or the other. Victorian was not the case. Victorian did both, which is partly why I like it so much, because you have the ability to do both, right? On the approach for the family, I had the picturesque garden. On the approach for guests, I had the beautiful garden. And they are both seamlessly integrated here. I even added a little footpath to take you between the two, right? And then other details to note here as well that I quickly just want to go over while I can before I switch into Blender is I try to do things a lot in my environments where if I'm going to grow plants, in this case, these are climbing wisteria. I had the climbing wisteria come out of boxes, right? Because, you know, you look at the ground here, gravel. You're not going to have a lot of good stuff growing right here. So you do a planter box to get the wisteria to grow better, right? Wisteria also does not like shade. So you notice that right when the porte cochere starts, the wisteria stops growing because he's like, I don't want to be here. I want to be in the sun, right? Of course, I have overcast now, but you know, when it's sunny out, these things are going to be getting a lot of attention from the sun. Furthermore, when I do a lot of my 3D environments, I try to be as modular as possible, right? So you'll see here, this whole component, it looks complicated, right? This looks like a crazy mess of detail, but it is rather simple, especially due to the fact that all of these pieces are using the same material, right? So if I kind of break this down and look at an individual component, and hopefully Unreal doesn't crash because I'm streaming at the same time as showing all of this, right? This is actually not the material I want. Give me a minute here. It's going to take me a minute to find the right one. Okay, I think this is it. Okay, here we go. So this is the one, this single material right here is being used for tons of assets across the whole scene, right? And this is a layered material where I have multiple layers being stacked. And this is a technology that Unreal does. It doesn't work as well as I would like it to. It's a little bit clunky currently in the state. This probably needs a little bit more work to really be used in a true production environment. But nonetheless, it is awesome for personal projects. They did a great job for that there. And what's cool with the layered system is you can break down each individual component of your material setup, right? So I can go down here into my base color, and let's say I want for some reason a purple house. Suddenly, everything that shares this material, which is a lot, is looking purple, right? It looks really bad, but you can do it if you wanted to. But you'll see too, it doesn't change the color of the wood edges. The wood edges are on a different layer, right? So if I wanted to, I could make those wood edges, I can find them here, wood edge where, those can be a different color entirely, right? Color. I'm going to actually just do the power instead. So you can see I'm kind of pushing, pulling. I'm pulling these areas almost into white, right? Or I might go up to this one and you can see I can make all those edges like super bright and white or down to black, right? You know, it doesn't look good, of course. A lot of these settings are designed for you to like do subtle tuning of them. But what's driving all of this, what's giving me this level of control over all of these parts of my model is the fact that I'm working in a rather modular way, where if I look at a trim sheet, right? This is an RGB trim sheet. This material is applied to a bunch of parts of my house, and the way that this is broken down, right, is I have one channel, which is a red for, you know, edges, right? Another green for another various type of edge condition. I have blue for another type. And by mapping these different parts of a texture onto your models, all your models can share from one texture source, and you can control entire parts of your scene with only one single texture loaded into memory and have very easy control. So you can go back and change things like color on the fly, which is super important because if one of the things that you'll find in games, especially is if you're working with a team, you might have an art director who's like, I don't want this house to be green. I want it to be red or white or whatever. And if you make all of these props individually, if you make all the colors individually, and you don't think about building an environment in a modular way, you're going to find that you have to redo work if the art director changes his mind on something. And, you know, that happens in production. People change their mind. You can't avoid it, right? It is what it is. So it's important to be able to build in a way where when changes do come, you're prepared for them, right? So with those aspects in mind, I'm going to give a brief modeling demo of how I do some of my Victorian details, right? Because if you see a lot of my individual pieces here, I put quite a lot of modeling work into making them look good. I don't always recommend doing this for people. It's a lot of extra time for only a key couple images. But if you want a lot of images, like in my case I did, it's important to do, right? For this image, for instance, right? This is a camera angle I set up because I wanted this individual image. So I'm going to look through this camera, and I'm going to see all that detail up close, right? Additionally, when I'm setting up my images, I often will do this too. I will go in and I will add materials. I will add post-process materials onto my image, which can give me the Fibonacci sequence from earlier. So you can see when I compose this image, I tried to align this vertical to the vertical of the golden rectangle, right? And I do this by checking different orientations, right? I try to align the camera angle for this part of the spiral here, right? So you can know that your images are well composed in a classically beautiful way if you use these overlays to get an image. And what's especially cool is I did that on the whole house level. So please excuse the weird purpleness here. And I'm going to throw in the phi scales, the thing I referenced earlier, those triangles that have the ratios of the golden rectangle built in. I'm going to make this 90 degrees. I'm gonna actually turn off lighting so I don't lag myself out. There we go. And you'll find that if you scale this up to the full length of the house, right? These are the divisions of the architecture. Things will rather nicely align. Take a look at this. I made the top of my bay window here align, not exactly, but I made it align pretty close. And that's one thing with these. You never have to be exact, right? No one's asking you to be exact with these divisions. They are just general guides to help you place detail, right? So as long as you get pretty close, you're good. And it will help you get a really well-composed piece of architecture, right? You can see that this piece, this upper dental band follows nicely, this kind of string course dental follows into this division of phi. And then these divisions also correspond, right? So actually I can make it a little bit higher to even get more here. There we go. And when I'm placing all these details, I will often check it because architects would do this all the time. At least classical architects would do this. Modern architects only occasionally do this, like Le Corbusier, early 20th century architect, used these diagrams a lot in the book Towards a New Design, French book on architecture, really good. He talks about using these guidelines for modern architecture, but not all modern architects do it. But yeah, you can see here, everything is aligning. That's what you want, and you want it to be done in this format. Because with architecture, you have to align to an orthographic view. You have to align to a view that is straight on because you don't know how the viewer is going to be seeing this, right? With a camera, you can always kind of dictate where the composition is going to be focused on because you have control over the camera. So like a movie director, they will compose their scenes to a specific angle. You can't do that with architecture because with architecture, you never know the exact point of view your viewer is going to be looking at a location from. You can kind of guess it, right? Like you can make paths that sort of guide the eye, but people can turn their heads and it breaks your composition. So therefore, you use a orthographic alignment, right? You align it to a house's elevation. And in video games, same principle. Because the camera is not in your control, with the exception of cutscenes, the gamer has the ability to turn the camera and to control it to wherever you want. Therefore, if you compose to orthographic views like in architecture, you're going to guarantee that your designs are artistically composed correctly, no matter the angle in which somebody is viewing the design from. So that's like a good thing to keep in mind, is that this phi scale shape is really, really helpful in letting you align, right? Just keep in mind, you want to align to the horizontals. That is what you're looking for, right? And then your vertical axis and your horizontal axis, your multiple horizontal axes here, they're all what are important. This triangular part, this part that comes, the hypotenuse of the triangle that comes down, that is not anything worth aligning to. That is just there to help draft this when you do the architectural drawing construction, which is if you want to do that construction, I know my workshop covers that. Otherwise, you can Google for Steve Bass. He does a lot of hand drawing constructions of this online. He does an incredible job on how to draw this shape just with a compass and with rulers. And of course, once you draw something physically, you can always scan it and turn it into 3D, right? So that said, I'm going to move into Blender real quick and give a quick modeling demo on some architectural details before we open it up to Q&A. So I'm going to have to disable my screen for a moment here again.
Yeah, that was great. And I'm glad Unreal didn't crash. Yeah. Because I'm always worried, like, oh boy, we're streaming this, and yeah, but no, that looked really cool. I want to live in that house too.
Yeah, right. It's only going to cost an arm and a leg to get something like that nowadays.
Yeah.
But we can have fun living in the virtual world pretending.
Exactly. Actually, you said you're opening a Blender now, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
While you're opening that, just a quick question from let's see if I can click on this real quick. There we go. Can I get a job if I can only work with Blender? You talked about this a little bit before, like it's kind of like using the tools you have to make something really beautiful rather than using everything just because you could say use everything.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that if you just know Blender, that's a good place to start. I do think Blender by itself might not be enough in a lot of cases. Like if I'm interviewing somebody, especially for an entry-level role, I'm going to be looking at, okay, do they have 3D modeling skills? And Blender will answer that, right? But I'm also going to be looking at how do they texture their models too, in which case I might want to see Substance Painter. So if you compare Blender and Substance Painter, you'll be in a really, really strong spot. Now, if you can also maybe on the side get a little bit of knowledge of game engines, Unity, Unreal, any other game engine, that'll push you a little bit forward. But you know, Blender, I heavily recommend focusing on Blender, and I heavily recommend Substance Painter as like the two key things that you should learn first and go from there. See if you like it too. You know, if you like those programs, you can take them further, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is it opening?
I have Blender open here too.
Nice.
And
oh, I see it. Yep. I'll go ahead and turn it on. Let's see. And boom, there you go.
Beautiful. So I've loaded in these patterns, right? These are architectural details from old pattern books. And pattern books were a concept that came from the 19th century. Basically, back at that time, architects weren't really a thing. I mean, you had them, but it wasn't as widespread as it is now. So therefore, most people did constructions via the role of an architect builder. The architect builder is basically like what contractors are now. So if you wanted a house built, you would ask an architect builder, and the architect builders wouldn't necessarily always design the houses. They would replicate what they saw in pattern books. And pattern books were basically like magazines that went out all across the United States where trained architects, which there weren't as many of back then, they would draw all of these beautiful details. And sometimes they'd even let you order the details like an Amazon service. You could like, you know, let's say you had a homestead out in like, you know, Iowa or something, right? And you wanted to have like a beautiful mansion, you could go and buy one of these pattern books from Chicago, and they would manufacture a lot of architectural details in Chicago, ship them out to your homestead on wagon, like an Amazon delivery service. And then your contractor, AKA the architect builder, would then put these together and build you a house, right? So you can find tons of pattern books all over eBay. They are all over the place because they are so ancient and there's so many of them. And these are all like 100-year-old designs, 200-year-old designs, right? And they're all stuff that you see, like modular pieces from a catalog that these architect builders, these contractors would build out of, right? So I'm going to start here with, this is called turned work because a lot of this was basically turned on a lathe. And a lathe is just basically, we still use them a lot today. Carpenters use them. They're just like big spinning blades, right? Or rather, you spin the object and the blade is stationary and you can get all these beautiful radial carvings in a rather easy method. It's a very cool tool to use. So when I'm doing a design like this, I use curves a lot. And this is the main thing I want to get across with my modeling is not a lot of people model this way, but it makes sense for these sorts of architectural constructions. And here's why, right? When you look at all of these details in here, these aren't crazy curves. These aren't ellipses. They aren't compound curves. These are simply circles and arcs. It's all circles and arcs because the way that lathes work is you use tools that are in the profile of the shape you want to cut. So often the carpenters will have like a straight up curved chisel and then they will again get this curved cut, right? So you can achieve that by basically just getting a curve, this is a circle. I just did a curve circle here, and then I will just start going crazy. I will go in here and I will just, scale, duplicate, do it again, and I'll just keep duplicating and scaling curves. And then when I'm happy with them, I'll right click and then convert them to meshes. And then now they're edges. And I will just go to town on then pulling down pieces. I'll extrude down. I will, convert this one to a mesh. I will delete some vertices out. I just try to be fast here. And I will just try to very quickly carve out this shape by using these curves and linking them up to locations, right? And I would just keep doing that over and over again. Grab the circle again, put the circle in there. And by doing it in this method too, what you'll find is you will start to build like a mental map of how to do these details. So sometimes you might make your own designs, right? Like I often will, instead of relying on these old patterns, I will make my own designs by following some of the same principles that I am seeing with these shapes, right? So it's just a matter of trying to do this often. And what I'll try to use a lot of circles. And then I'll use add-ons, like this is the pivot transform add-on for Blender, where I can just choose a point, set my cursor to the point, set my pivot to the cursor. Now I have a circle with a pivot on the bottom here, which lets me move it from that location. I'll convert this to a mesh, pull up the vertices, and then work my way up across the whole thing, right? I do a lot of snapping. So I do snapping by going up to the snap, set the center, set snap target to vertex, and then I will hold control to snap to another vertex just so things align. So I can get these straight pieces are called fillets. So I will get the fillets here. Actually, on the topic too of the names of these things, they all have different names, right? The flat sections are called fillets. The big flat ones are fascias. The other ones that are important to know is the cyma recta and cyma reversa. We'll get to those in a moment. And then the ovalo. Ovalo is just like basically a sort of weird ellipsed hat, like kind of quarter circle condition, right? Those are the main ones you see a lot of. In Victorian, you see a lot of these beads a lot, especially when they stack the beads vertically. It's a common molding profile. But in this case, I'm just going in here. This diagonal is a splayed fascia. This is more like a splayed fillet though, because it's so small. Cut out again. And I'm only going to go up partly. I don't want to do the whole spun piece here for a reason that you'll see in a moment. The main idea too here is that I'm not really worrying about my triangle count either. Often when I model for my personal projects, my triangle count is infinite. And then when I model for video games, I still have usually a really high triangle count just because games now are so good at doing LODs that you can have higher detail base meshes, and then your LODs can kind of resolve a lot of the performance for you. Plus, if you're somebody who's using Nanite, for Nanite people out there, polygon count is really not an issue whatsoever anymore. I mean, you still don't want to go, millions and millions of polygons in a prop like this, but if this prop was like, 5,000 triangles, for instance, no one's going to complain about that in Nanite, or if you have a game engine with LODs that can handle a mesh that is at a higher count of triangles. So I'm snapping that there, putting this guy into place, converting back into a mesh. And then we have this shape right here. So for this one, what you'll find, what's cool, what I really like about Victorian is you have a lot of these weird shapes where it's not like a perfect circle, but it's like this partly cut in one, right? And you get that by just making your circle gigantic. Because you think about like when architects are drawing these shapes, they're drawing them with a compass, right? And the way compass works is you plot your point and then you draw your circle from that point. So the point that you're drawing from would be like right here where the pivot is. The architect is putting the needle and the compass there, and then they are doing the pencil part of their compass to then draw this curve. So maybe it's something more like this. Yeah, that feels about right. I'll convert this into a mesh then, and you'll see that I get this nasty faceting. You can see the circle is not really smooth anymore because I scaled it so much. And you can resolve that just by going in and adding like a subdivision surface, pumping this to like 3, right? And then converting it back into a mesh. And then suddenly my circle feels curved again, which is good. I just added a lot more extra polygons to make it happen. So connect these guys together and then combine. And now I just want everything to be rather nicely aligned. So I want all of these to be combined. So I'm combining all these together. I'm just doing Control J here to combine all these meshes together that I constructed, all these edges. And it is rather nasty right now with the overlaps, but that's easy. You just merge your vertices together and you can resolve that general nastiness of stuff not being where you want them to be. All right, then put that guy there, and we should be good to go. Now I only did half, and there's a reason why I only did half of this spun piece, and that is because we're gonna do something fun here. I am going to add a modifier called screw, right? And by default, it looks weird. I'm getting this. This is not what I want. I just need to change the axis. So the axis from which this is being spun, in this case, it defaults to Z. I'm gonna make it Y. And I get this, right? And it looks bad. But using the pivot transform add-on that I talked about earlier, I'm going to go into transform, and I get this little guy, this new pivot, and I can move the pivot. And watch what happens. As I move the pivot in real time, the screw model updates, and now I have this bad boy right here, right? So I go into shaded view, look at that, right? Now, if that wasn't cool enough, I'm going to find the center of this guy and this guy. So you can find the center of any two vertices just by selecting the two vertices and then snapping your cursor to the two vertices, and your cursor will go to the middle point, right? I'm going to then set my pivot. Actually, I don't want to do that. I'm going to do something else. I'm going to, well, I'll give you an example first. So I'm going to add a mirror modifier. And you'll find that with the mirror modifier, it's using the bottom here, and it's just mirroring it by the pivot point. I don't want to do that. Oh, actually, I do want the mirror, but I want to do something else. I'm going to take a empty node, plane axes. It defaults to the location of my cursor, right? And then I'm the mirror object from a mirror modifier. I'm going to choose that empty, and then I only want the Y, and I want to bisect, and that'll combine the two meshes together in real time, and then I'm going to flip. And now, by moving this, I can like find shapes. Like, look, check this out. I can like move this up and down. I can find new shapes with the shape that I already drew, or I can go into the original, right? I can pump this back to that midpoint and I get this guy, right? So just by using Blender modifiers, you can do a lot. Additionally, under screw, you can do things like you can change how many vertices you want, right? This is basically a polygon count right here under steps. So 16, bad faceting, right? You see that around there, not good. So I might pump it to like 32. You even still see some faceting. Maybe 48 was good. You know, I don't really think too much about what the number is. I just do it until it stops looking jagged. And when it looks smooth, that's how it works. And I do that way. Some artists would tell you it has to be a certain number. I don't really care because I've worked with so many art directors, and an art director, they don't care about numbers either. They're going to see something like this, and an art director is just going to say, this feels like there's too many edges. It feels jagged. I don't like it. And the art director will ask you to change it, right? And the art director is only going to be happy when this is like, when you can't see those facets anymore. So make it whatever you want until the art director can't tell that it's not smooth, right? And then now for the bottom part here, this is a block. It goes from a square condition, a rectilinear condition, into the curve. There's a classic method to resolve that. This was a method invented in the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul. It's called the pendentive, and it's how you go from a square into a circle condition. It's really cool. You basically create this shape, this like arc thing. That's a pendentive, and it is just this. You just grab each of the vertices on your guy here. You bevel, which I'm doing with B, and then you just add a bunch of divisions, and look at that. Now I've got a condition where I go from straight into curved very nicely, put this into place, and now I've resolved that connection, and boom, there you go. I have the bottom base. Now another thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to, especially in this piece, you'll see that it's like razor sharp, right? Not good. An art director is going to call that out, and they're not going to like it. So one way to resolve that is if you do baked normals, you can do that whole method. It's a whole thing. But for the sake of speed, and what I'm seeing more and more of these days is not baking because it takes too long, and artists will just add bevels, right? So I'm using the hard ops modifier in Blender. Highly recommend this add-on. And it will basically, you click Q on your keyboard and you get access to all these little functions. The most important though is bevel right here. And it just lets you do, if you click it, it'll add bevels to your edges based on your topology. And it looks bad at first. All you have to do is sharpen, and then now it's good to go. You might also have to apply your scale, and then it's going to look busted at first. But if I change this to, I don't know, like that, and I look at the wireframe, it's not quite right. I might need to also always go up here, check your face orientation, make sure there's no red. There isn't, because that means a flipped normal. And angle shouldn't be 60, it should be 30. And you'll find that this edge is, as I increase this, this edge will start to get smoother, right? And some of this will break a little bit. That's fine. We can just find an angle that works here. And you're going to get some nastiness, so you can connect these vertices to kind of fix that. And you're going to get a new bevel being generated, right? This edge is feeling less crooked or less razor sharp now. And I probably should have done this earlier. I'm going to set the units instead of meters to centimeters, just so I have more to work with. I'm just going into scene units, going from meters to centimeters. And now when I do these modifiers, I'm going to have smaller numbers to work with, right? So this bevel needs to be rather sharp, because probably I added too many edges here. So when I made this a bevel, you know what, I'm going to do that again. I'm going to go back in time a little bit just because I want to make less of those edges to get this to work properly. I'm going to go back into here, select only the vertices, bevel the vertices, and I'm going to do the same thing, but I'm going to use like less subdivisions now on the bevel, maybe like this many. And now I'm going to go back in and add that bevel. And I'm going to add multiple divisions to this guy, 3. And then I want to connect to these vertices. And what this requires you to do is to basically play with these numbers until you get something like that, where, okay, this is feeling a little bit better. You can tell now this is less razor sharp along these edges. And what's happening is you don't want intersecting triangles. Like if you look at the wireframe, this looks fine, right? Because these new bevels that are being created, this new topology is not breaking anything. So maybe we can push that to 0.2 and it's still fine. It looks like it is. Yeah, it's fine there. And now we have an edge that's not razor sharp, right? Now what's cool is I look at this guy, right? I'm going to put him side by side with this one. And this one on the right, it has 3 segments in that bevel, right? And then I'll make one that has no bevel at all. So you can see, compare. So this one, razor sharp edge. This one, softer edge. This one also softer edge, but I'm going to go from segments 3 down to segments 1. And it's going to break, but I'm going to add a weighted normal. And now these two look rather similar, right? But the one on the left is cheaper because I'm only using one segment and I'm using the weighted normal to smooth everything out, right? And what I'm going to get out of this is a more performant mesh that still looks quite nice and has a softer edge, right? And I can make this edge even softer if I wanted to keep adding divisions here. Like if I keep going and adding, connecting all of these vertices across, I'm going to reduce some of those shading errors, and it's going to let me go bigger on those bevels, but it's going to take too long. So if you want to do this for real and have no shading errors, just make sure your vertices are connected like so, and you should be good on if you do that on all sides, right? But for the sake of time for this thing, I'm not going to do that. One more thing I also want to do to help break up the monotony of this object is another note I often get from art directors is stuff looks way too razor sharp, especially if you're using scanned assets in your scene. Scanned assets have very smooth edges that feel deformed and rather random. You can get a level of that same level of like scanned quality by using modifiers in a rather cheap way. So you add a couple of divisions, right? Maybe this many is fine. And then I'm going to add a displace modifier, and it's going to break everything at first. That's fine. I'm going to go into new, add a coordinates, it can be whatever direction, RGB to XYZ. I click this little show texture button, go into image or movie, go to clouds. It's basically just generating random texture. It's kind of like a Houdini type of workflow in Blender. And then under gray color, I'll go from grayscale into color. And then I'll make the size like big, right? I want something like this where the object is getting totally distorted, but on a big scale. And in this case, I will then go in and I will only give it like a little pop, like a 0.01 perhaps. Maybe that's not enough. Maybe a 0.05. That's too much. Maybe 0.02. Now, look at this edge. Now it has a warp to it. So if an art director sees this object in the game, he's not going to like say, oh, that's a razor sharp object. It's going to look like a natural curve that a carpenter would have carved, because those carpenters, they're not perfect. They're not machines, right? They're going to their hands are going to move while they're carving this out without doing the cut. You're going to get busted edges. Sometimes I'll even go in and I'll duplicate the displace, and I will make it I'll make it its own thing. It's not instanced anymore just by clicking the one there. And then I will, on the second version, the second displace, I will make this one tiny, right? So I'll make the noise rather small. And this one will then give me an additional layer of smaller warping, but this one I need to make even more subtle, right? Make it 0.005. And this warp is adding an even greater level of realism to that edge, right? So what I get in the end is an object that is feeling a little bit warped. And I can do this on this guy. I can take this dude and I can copy the modifiers. But if I do copy the modifiers, it will break these. So I'll need to convert to mesh again to make all the modifiers baked into the topology. I will then copy the modifiers over from Control L, copy modifiers, and then now this guy is going to get that same level of displaced randomness, and then also he's going to get the bevel workflow. So the bevel workflow is not going to show up though until I make the scale capped. There you go. And look at that. Look at these edges, right? Like look at on and off on what the bevel does, right? It's off weighted normal. So without weighted normal and bevel, razor sharp. With weighted normal and bevel, beautiful, right? So that's a good way to get your edges. And then when you have this mesh, you have a lot of options, right? You can take this and make this the high poly for a bake. If you're going to be working on a game, this is a baking workflow. If you're working on a nanite game, maybe you just load this as your base mesh. If you're doing a game with good LODs, maybe it's a base mesh, right? You have options once this piece is built out this way, right? And it gives the artist a lot of control, and they can always go backwards, turn off stuff, try out new modifiers, and not destroy all of the work that they had previously done. So I highly recommend the Blender modifier workflow. And because of this level of power and the ability to very quickly resolve notes that you might get from an art director, right? So highly recommend all of that. Now, there is two things I really want to quickly go over. We didn't have time to really get into designing all of this. That would have been fun to do that. But I'm just going to go over two quick ones here. The first being that I want to show this trim piece. This is a crown molding that is, or basically a cornice that is running along this gable here, and gable being like the roof extension that comes out this way. And generally these shapes, the most common molding for these cornices is the cyma recta. The cyma recta is super common. It's basically an S curve. And I want to very quickly go over how to build this, right? So I start with a plane, and I do this. I make the edges align, then I delete this guy. And what I get is a cut, right? Often it's 45 degrees, but it can be whatever, right? Maybe this one's not even exactly 45. I'll do something like this, right? Now it's probably like 44, 43 angle or something. I don't know. But the way to draft this is you have to draft a bunch of circles, and you have to construct what's like called a flower of life pattern. It's complicated. It's annoying. You have to do this all the time in classical drawing. But we can cheat it and do it more rapidly in 3D just by going into adding subdivisions, or rather, it's basically the loop cut tool, and I'm going to add 2. And what it's doing is, because this is not a quad, it's just adding vertices instead of the edges themselves. And I'm just going to, you can see here, I get 2 vertices that split this into 3 parts. So I have 1 part, 2 part, 3 part, all equal, right? If I was to duplicate these, if I was to duplicate this guy, drag him out, right? Make these the same. If I measure these guys with the Measure It plugin, which comes default with Blender, you just have to enable it in the settings. Where is Measure It? It's in View. If I select those 2 segments, 0.14 meters. I'm actually going to change that to centimeters, 14.15 centimeters. I should measure this one. It should also be, yeah, look at that, 0.14. It should be the same, right? Because these are equal divisions of, these are 3 equal divisions. Like, look at that. All of these guys are perfectly oriented into 3 parts. And then I'm going to take this one. I'm going to drag him down, snap him to there. And I'm going to take this one, snap him to here. Then when I click these 2, I'll bevel. Oh, actually, it's not what I want. I don't want to snap it to that location exactly. I want to, let's see. I want to do this. Give me a minute here. Actually, mess this up. This needs to not be at the top. This needs to be at that point. And then this one needs to be at this point. And then now I'm going to add the 2. I'm going to put him here and him here. This should, no, that's not doing it. Oh, it's because I have that guy. Okay, sorry. Put this guy here and this guy here, like this, right? So you get this Z shape. And then press B to bevel, and what you'll find is I'm getting that shape naturally, that S curve. And it is capping at one point, because that's what, because Blender wants to try to keep all of the, it tries to keep your bevel not intersecting itself, which I don't want here. I want it to intersect itself. So I'm going to click C to turn off that clamp, and I'm just going to get it close to itself, right? And then I'm going to then end up into this condition. This is a pretty close cyma recta curve, It's not perfect, because if you want it perfect, you have to do the full drafting method, but it is rather close, and you get this nice curve. And then now I can actually pump these guys up. And then I have that guy moves there. I have a semi-rectangle molding profile. I'm going to fill all of it with F to fill the polygons. And there we have it. Now I can just extrude this out, right? And this is my molding detail. So I might even go in here and I'll add like a fillet condition. So I'll delete these edges just to get this. And I will do something like that, right? And that is looking more like a traditional type of cornice that you might see. And then I use a thing called the angle tool, right? This is an add-on I also got for Blender, where if you create an edge, you can take your selected edges, select another edge, and you can corner it out by doing that. And then suddenly I have a corner to my molding profile. And then all I need to do is do my alignment to the roof angle, right? So just need to find I've made these horizontal, so it's messing with my mind in terms of how to rotate these guys. So I'll scale him down into position, right? I measured this earlier and it was like 40 degrees. So we're going to do that. We're going to rotate by 40. So I need to rotate in the Z axis for this. Oh. There we go. And I will just try to move that into play. Select everything because it's local. Just drag this up, right? Same method as earlier. I will add a empty plane axis, put it somewhere roughly at the center point, right? And I will mirror based on the empty, and I will just bisect, flip, and then there we have a basically molding, cornice molding for gable that is all still rather modular. And then I will then just pull out these ones, right? And like, look at that. I already have this whole shape connection here. So that is a pretty cool method to making this all work. Finally, what I will do when I'm texturing an asset like this is I will do a trim sheet. I'll make everything a mesh. And when I UV this out, open the UVs, I will go into Zing UV. This is another Blender plugin that's great. Mark by angle. Select the corner, mark seam. I will do an automatic unwrap. It's actually not what I want because I need to actually also add seams there. And I will mark a seam on the corners. Get rid of that guy, that edge. Now it'll unwrap everything straight, right? Rotate it all. And then I'm just going to add a trim sheet onto this. So I will just create a new material, add an image input, go into desktop because I prepared this earlier, find my trim sheet, plug it in, and then let's view it, right? And what I want to do when I'm doing these trim sheets is I want to align edges to basically edges, right? So if I select this, for instance, I'll select this whole guy and I'll like make the top edge align and align, right? And I'll just do this for every single mesh in the trim sheet. Trim sheets are like horizontal mappings of edges, right? And then what I'll find is like the blue lines up at the bottom, red lines up at the top, some blue there. And what you get is you'll get the ability in Unreal to do that level of trim functionality I was showing earlier with all the color overrides and the layering and all of that by using these colors. It looks bad here, but it'll look great in Unreal if you set up the shader for it. A lot of that I get to in my workshop video if you're interested in learning how to do the trim sheet. But my point here is that we do trim sheets all the time in video games, and this is generally the method, right? You do long horizontal components like this, and you just map them to the same texture. So yeah, with that said, I went a little bit longer than I wanted to, but I should still have some time for questions for all of you guys. And in the meantime, when I'm doing questions, I'm going to open up something real quick to show you, but Should be able to do some questions now.
Hi. Whoa, that was awesome. I have a I have a friend who does woodworking back east in Massachusetts, and I wish I told him about this. His mind would go, because he tries to do like, yeah. I mean, it was just so cool to see that happen in the digital realm, And I really like how you added those like warp effects to make it a little more realistic, like what would happen over time. Yeah, wood warps a little bit, and like you said, like when woodworkers are making things, they're not robots. They're gonna maybe get tired at one point. Oh, I cut that corner a little too sharp, or whatever the case may be. So it's cool that you think about those aspects of this modeling, because that's what makes it more real, and believable.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I've done, I do a little bit of woodworking as a side project. I mean, I'm a very much an amateur hobbyist, right? So I'm not really that good, but when I work with like power tools, yeah, absolutely. Like it's so easy for you to get tired, and then suddenly your cut is not as straight as it probably should
Yeah,
be, right?
totally. Yeah, no, it's but it still fascinates me. He made me a stool that he was visiting in Massachusetts, and he put a stool in his like big suitcase. I don't know how he did it, but I was just like, oh my God, you made that from scratch? And it looks so basic, but when you look at it in detail, you're like, wow, everything has to fit perfectly, like a square peg and a square hole. Like it sounds simple, but when you're making it, there's so much craftsmanship involved. Even something as simple as making a stool. So seeing you do something like this digitally is just like,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's faster ways to do this, right? Like the methods I went over in some cases might not be the most fast or the most optimal, but for me, they're the closest for me to get in touch of how it would be done in real life, which is important for me because I think that, especially now with games getting more and more realistic with the graphical fidelity, right? The thing that
yeah,
often holds back scenes is, oh, you have beautiful graphics. The lighters and the engineers are geniuses because they programmed all of this. But if the environment is not looking, if it feels like it was made by a computer, it throws off the illusion, all the magic that the
yeah,
programmers put into doing their incredible code.
no,
So
totally.
it's like part of our job as environment artists is to try to make the coders look as good as possible, make their technology look good, right?
Yeah, yeah. Um, are you ready for some questions?
Absolutely.
I could pop up them on the screen here if that works for you.
Yeah.
Um, okay, here is one. Here's the first one. When you're transitioning from architecture into games, what were the first spaces or communities where you actually started meeting people in the industry, and how did that happen?
It was Gnomon, actually. I started
Oh,
taking online courses at Gnomon. I didn't do their full degree program. Rather, I took some individual courses, and I became friends with one of the instructors I had, Devin Fay. He's an amazing artist. He's an art director or I think creative director now over at Riot Games. Genius guy. I mean, great dude to work with. And he introduced me to a lot of his friends. Um, he helped me get my first job. We hung out a lot, and that was really what did it. And then from there, everything kind of cascaded, right? So if you can find like courses are a great way to do it. Um, I had basically reached out to Devin because it was an online course I took with him, and then I had reached out to him on Facebook, and then we just became like Facebook friends and started talking over the years, and then that led to hanging out in real life and among other things.
um, no, that's. I had a feeling you were going to say no, but see, Gnome's like just seems like it's such a great community. There's so many people that work in the industry that know of it or went to school there. That makes perfect sense. Um, Here is another question that I wanted, because you talked about Substance Painter before. Hold on a second. There we go. What's a good alternative software to Substance Painter? Is there, in your opinion? Would you use something else ever?
You can, I mean, it's tough, right? Because technically, a lot of the stuff you do in Substance Painter, you could do in Photoshop, and by that logic, even GIMP. GIMP being the free tool, or Affinity Photo. If
Mhm.
you don't want if you want like a non-subscription version of like Photoshop, Affinity Photo is kind of that. And technically, anything you can do in Substance Painter, you can probably do in Photoshop or Affinity or GIMP, right? But what Substance Painter does and what makes it unique is that it keeps all of your materials together. So,
Mm.
the way video games work is we have what's called PBR, which is basically multiple texture maps to build up a shader. And that basically means you're working on multiple images at the same time. And that's where Photoshop kind of falls short. It can't really do that properly without like a lot
Mm.
of add-ons and whatnot. So Substance Painter does that by default. Substance Designer does it as well. I think Blender now has a way to do it. I haven't done it though in Blender, so I'm not sure. But I think technically you can do a form of Substance Painter with Blender geometry nodes. But it's a lot of technical setup, and if you want to go down that route, it's possible. But I don't think Substance Painter is a terrible deal either, because Substance Painter I think is $20 a month if I'm not mistaken, which for a texturing tool, it's kind of annoying to have to pay the monthly fee, but it's one of the better tools, and for me, I feel like I'm getting my money's worth.
Yeah. No, it sounds great. Hold on a second here. I'm just scrolling through the chat. There's so many questions. It's bonkers. That's great though. People are really excited by this. So here's one. I know it changes from studio to studio, but how important is it to create larger assets like mountains, boulders, etc. as an environment artist? Not every studio has Vista artists.
Yeah, this gets into the specialization thing I was talking about earlier, where specializing in something like being a terrain artist, it is something that you can do. I have a really good friend from Dice, or ex Dice employee, who's basically done that. He's made like this incredible career for himself off of doing terrain, and he has this incredible understanding. It took him a lot of years though to build up that level of knowledge on how to do terrain work. And I think when he started in the business, he didn't start just doing terrain, right? He like built himself into that role. So it's something that is important. Studios will use those people, but it's not always worth putting all your eggs into one basket when you're starting off. Sometimes like specializing like that might be better to do as you progress through your career and you want to like distinguish yourself from other artists. And plus it's job stability, right? Like if you can do things that other artists can't, your chances of getting laid off by studios is lessened.
That's a very good point. Yeah. And that's the way it is with really everything. I mean, in a way, that's kind of common sense when it comes to employment. I mean, as I said before, my background is more cinema production, but I was a guy that I was a camera person that could edit, and an editor who could also, back in the day, author DVDs when that was a thing. So I think it also helps to have sort of multiple sort of like tricks up your sleeve, if possible.
Yeah, it does. And it's a good idea if that's a path you want to go to. And I should say too, like, if the person asking this question, like if you love terrain, go for it, right? Like if terrain is your passion, it's you're gonna have a lot of fun doing it. Like for me, architecture is my passion, so I like to do architectural assets. I can do some terrain. I don't love it, but I can sort of do it. But architecture is really where I shine. But other people might like terrain, and then for people who like terrain, you can even go down a whole list of books that are great for that. Like there's a great series of books by John McPhee, Pulitzer Prize author. He writes these amazing books on geology. It's like basically like geology textbook level knowledge, but he writes them in the format of stories. That's super entertaining to read. Amazing author. So if you read like Basin and Range by John McPhee, or Rising Up from the Plains, or In Control of Nature, those are all John McPhee books that will just give you so much excitement and passion about geology and terrain in a way that you can then apply it to like making those environments in games.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. I like the books that you talked about earlier, and when you're talking about like the Fibonacci, all of that is just like it's so huge to know, to just see those sort of commonalities between like architecture and photography and painting. You're like, oh, I noticed composition is kind of the same. So the more you can just read up on these types of things, the more it's just going to make you a better artist. So
Yeah.
Speaking of which, oh, this is something here's a great question. This is something everyone I'm sure deals with. Do you have any idea of when to stop pushing a specific texture or kit piece in an environment? I've gotten more experience, I find it hard to consider something done.
Yeah, this is one of the hardest things I think for environment artists, because we always are going to find flaws in our work, right? Like just today, looking at my Victorian house again, I noticed like 10 things I should probably not have done or fixed or changed, right? And what I'll do is I will first always try to focus on like the big picture, right? Like if you can glance at your image and you don't see any glaring issues, you know it's closer to being completed, right? So like the big picture read, thinking about that helps a little bit in being able to stop yourself. But I mean, ultimately, it just comes down to like your personality more than anything and how much time you have, right? Like, I one of my friends a while back said that like, you do these environments and it's like working like a model train set or like a ship in the bottle. Like it can be a hobby that you can work on for years and years and years and never finish, and you can just enjoy it, right? And if that's what you want to do, there's no point in stopping. But if you want to finish a portfolio piece because you want to get hired in like a year from now, you have to give yourself a timeline. You have to say 7 months, 8 months, 9 months. I have to stop, and only let it turn into like a lifelong project if you want to just have fun and build for the sake of building and polish for the sake of polishing. Because you'll never finish an art piece. It's just like what do you want to get out of the art piece, right?
Yeah, and do you ever, just as an aside to that, do you find that if you show something you've worked on to somebody else, does that help inform you whether something is done or not?
Um,
Like some like for example, if you make this and they're like, "Oh my God, that's so beautiful," and you're like, "Oh wow, they didn't notice the little flaw in the window." Like, I don't know, is that something that has ever informed you, like whether to keep working on something or to stop working on something? Or
when you're in a production environment, absolutely, right? Because you're going to be checking in with your art lead daily. You're going to be checking with the art director, and they're going to be giving you feedback and letting you know if something feels done or not. So when you have deadlines imposed by a studio, or when you have bosses, like that'll be huge, right? For that reason. And then personal projects, I don't usually get as much input. My wife gives me a lot of input, and she gives really really great input, so that helps me a lot. My wife kind of has like more of an artistic background though too, so she's very good at telling me, okay, what's good and what's not good, right? Um, so if you have people like that in your life, that can be super helpful for personal projects. And then of course with the studio environment, you have to listen to the boss as far as when something's done or not.
yeah, that reminds me of something you said earlier about the auteur. You showed the slide about the auteur theory, and you're like David Lynch and Stanley Kubrick, and then you said like this is a real super collaborative medium in which to work. It's not, yeah. So
Yeah, it's like Stanley Kubrick, right? I love him. I love his movies, and he's one of the greatest directors of all time. But you hear stories about his film productions, and people have they have opinions about him, about working with him, and it's not always the most positive, right? Because he had a vision that he wanted to get across, and he let no one get in the way of that.
yeah, that's true. I know we could talk forever about that. I love talking about that stuff. Here's another question for you. What are your thoughts on environment artists collaborating with level designers to make environments that don't just look good, but also are playable? Thinking if that could help an artist stand out.
Yeah, that's a good one if you're in a school environment. I mentioned earlier that degrees are not necessary in game development, but school programs, like I'm thinking about USC because I've worked with a couple people that have graduated from USC, and one of the cool things that USC school does is that when you're attending classes there, you are working on like mock game projects with other people in the class. So if you're doing like art, you're going to be paired up with like a designer, and you guys are going to like do have a semester project or something. I don't know if it's exactly like this because it's been a while since I've talked about this with my buddy, but um, at one point, like they had this system where you were like teaming up with other classmates, like designers, and you were putting together a whole game project, and that does look good to employers. And then, of course, if you are in a production environment, you have to work with the level designers, right? It's not only a good thing to do, you have to do it. And
Mm.
sometimes that can be easy. Sometimes you get brilliant level designers that take your art to the next level. Other times you get level designers that you want to fight with. And part of, learning how to, part of like getting your artistic idea across is being able to be like, okay, I understand what the level designers are trying to go for with this environment. How can I find a way to help them achieve their gameplay goal at the same time not sacrificing my artistic goal with the environment? Because sometimes you work with people that you have to have a little bit of back and forth with, right? You have to ask them what their goal is, and maybe you push back a little bit if if there's a place for you to get your idea to sync up with their goal, right? And that's part of the level art and the level design and environment art give and take relationship is that a good relationship between art and level design is, checking each other, making sure that they're getting their goals across, you're getting your goals across, and you don't let one walk over the other, right? Art
Yeah.
shouldn't direct levels, and level designers, shouldn't like try to forcefully make art a certain way. It should be more of a good marriage between the two, right?
Yeah, and that goes back to something you talked about, and which I thought was so great. You mentioned the importance of soft skills and communication and being able to collaborate, because I feel like, I'm not sure. I mean, I teach at a couple of different schools, and that's something that I try to incorporate in classes is like, people want to work with people that they want to work with, like I will choose someone who is maybe slightly less skilled than somebody else, because I'm going to be spending all day with them. And I want that to be a cool person and a fun person. And I know they could do everything I need. Whereas person B might be perfect at everything, but they might be a real jerk, So learning those
Exactly. Like, you're not
skills.
going to want to work with the person that's not easy to work with,
Yeah.
even if they're great at their job.
Yeah. It's yeah, no, that's huge. And I love that pyramid. So if people are watching this YouTube video later, go back and look at the pyramid that Josh showed in the in your presentation. I thought that's a great way to sort of really just show, like, that was one of the best sort of examples of just sort of like step by step, like what it takes to basically level up and get, basically step into the career world with, like, I don't know, that was just really well done. I don't have the pyramid in front of me, so I'm trying to remember it, but I remember I was watching, I'm like, oh my God, this, I should show this to people.
Sorry, one thing to add on to with the level, I don't want to interrupt that too much, because that's a great point, but one thing to add on to the level design thing that I really just want to drill in with people watching this is one of the things that helped me a lot when I realized, like, how can I improve my relationships with the design team is ask them what is their intent, ask them what is their goal with a scene, because sometimes you'll get directions from a level designer and maybe they have a great idea behind the space, but they forget to tell you, right? And then you think that the idea that they have is just random, right? You don't understand what their intention is. And sometimes, you always have people that might not have a reason for doing something, in which case there should be a reason to do a design, because that's what design is. It's trying to achieve a certain experience, a certain goal, right? So there should always be an intent behind a design, and a good level designer is able to tell you what that intent is. And if they don't, you should ask them, right? Like, ask them what is their intent with the space. So if you do want to change something for art, like, okay, what I want to change might actually help their design, or maybe it'll hurt their design, but you kind of have an idea, you have a foundation of, like, okay, how is my art going to affect their goal? And I think that's when you have, like, some of the best level art and level design combinations, is when you guys are on the same page with what the intent of the space is supposed to be, right?
Yeah.
It's going to be like a combat space, is going to be an exploration space. Does it need to have combat play out in a certain way, right? Like, when I've worked on multiplayer games like VALORANT or Call of Duty maps, the level designers would say, like, I want the encounter between you and another player to play out like this, right? That's why we need this cover box in this certain location. And then, okay, I'm not going to change that cover box, right?
Yeah. Okay. No, that's all really good advice. That I love it. That goes beyond the technical.
Yeah.
Yeah. Here's a question that I feel like it's asked a lot, but I think it's still an important thing to think about, and that's this: what's something you wish you had learned earlier in your career? It's kind of a big question, but I guess if you had your mind now back then, what would you tell yourself?
Man, there's a lot there.
Yeah.
Man, there's about a million things, right? You always look in retrospect what you could change. I think one of the things that would have been beneficial for me to learn earlier on is like the value of kind of some of the production stuff I went over earlier, right? Like, it seems basic, but like stuff like Jira tickets and understanding how Perforce works
Mm.
and being able to do file management, not being scared of file management, but being able to embrace it and realizing that it's necessary for the project. I think those are things that I had no knowledge of going into this business that ended up becoming important, right? Of course, I could add on to that too. Like, I just rather recently found out about, I mentioned ICAA earlier. I wish I would have found out about them much earlier in my career because that's been an incredible organization to learn from in regards to doing classical architecture. So if there are certain classes or institutions that teach something that you like, perhaps try to seek those out sooner, so you can start using those skills sooner in your career.
Yeah, no, that's huge. That's I think that's really good advice. And that sort of connects to this one, which you've talked about a lot, but let's see if you can maybe talk about a little more detail. How do you get motivation? I know you've talked about like books and you've talked about just like architecture tours and things like that, but anything else you
Yeah.
could add to that?
Oh man. I mean, I will say architecture tours for me, it's like the best thing. I go on an architecture tour, I get so hyped up, right? Sketching too. Like if I bring a sketchbook and I'm in a city and I'm just sketching buildings like that, that's super exciting. But the other thing that I would say is playing great video games, right? Like I played Expedition 33 this year. By the way, won game of the year last night. Awesome, great to see. Um, that game when I played it, that was huge. Blueprints this year, I loved that game. In prior years, like Baldur's Gate 3, Cyberpunk 2077, Witcher 3, like all of these top level games, Red Dead Redemption 2, like all of these games are so inspiring when I see the work that these great artists and designers and developers put into building them. Even some of my own games, right? Like going back and, I love looking back at like Infinite Warfare, the first Call of Duty game I worked on. And the campaign in that game especially was really cool. Or like Call of Duty Warzone. There's some great experiences that I've had playing that game. That's absolutely inspiring.
Hmm.
Some
Yeah.
of the stuff at Riot, playing games there with my buddies that was a super inspirational experience.
No, I mean, that all makes sense. It's like a combination of things you just encounter in real life as well as things that you encounter that are directly connected to your career, right? That's great. I got one more question here, which I think a lot of people are thinking of similar questions to this. In an environment portfolio, would you expect the applicant to be responsible for every aspect they're presenting, or would you be okay with people using ready-made foliage or light rig?
The latter, 100%. My Victorian house I showed off, all the trees are straight up speed tree store assets.
Okay.
Um, yeah. So I 100% recommend artists to use pre-made assets if it's not the main focus, right? Like
Mm.
if you can go and now if your goal is you want to be a foliage artist, right? And you're trying to show off how good you are at foliage, obviously don't download speed tree store assets and
Yeah.
say that, you're a great artist because, you didn't make those, right? But if you're doing like what I did, like architecture, um, you know, I don't think it's a big deal to use pre-made assets because the focus is on the full environment, not necessarily the individual aspects. So it should just be on your focus. But the inverse of that is true too. Like if I was a terrain artist, I wouldn't expect to see a terrain artist doing great architecture in their terrain environment. If they
Mm.
downloaded some buildings off of like, the Unreal Market or ArtStation or wherever else and put them in their beautiful terrain, that would be totally acceptable to me if I was looking at like a portfolio, for instance.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Focus on your main thing and use the other aspects as the background, as the
Yeah.
supplements. That makes perfect sense. Um, yeah, there's a lot of questions, but we could be here all night. I wanted to see if you had anything else that you wanted to mention to talk about before we sort of wind down a little bit.
No, I don't think I had anything else other than just I want to thank everybody for being here and watching this. I know I covered quite a bit of information here, and it's kind of broadly reaching, right? Like there was some stuff that's more basic knowledge things for artists starting off or wanting to join the industry, right? And then also some more a little bit more advanced modeling stuff. So hopefully, like between the variety of stuff there was enough that everybody could get value out of this.
Yeah, no. And as I said before, when we started this up, my background is more, cinema and sound production and things like that. But I learned a lot just by watching it. And a lot of it's just being I'm constantly amazed by what technology can do. And when you went into the detail with the woodworking there in Blender, I was just like, oh my God, this is amazing.
Yeah.
So,
well, I do want to mention, you mentioned cinema. I have to shell out one of my projects.
Oh yeah.
So it's a shameless self-promotion.
Do it. This is time to do it.
I do recommend people, like if you thought this was interesting, and especially if you're a fan of cinema, and like a multimedia presentation stuff, I do have a project on YouTube called The New Harvey House, a descent into the Anthropocene, which is a 20-minute video that is very different than any other type of environment art that's ever been presented. I can assure you of that, because I end the video with like a multi-minute long, gigantic musical presentation using self-playing instruments synced up in Unreal 5 to all this art that I did. So if that sounds interesting, check it out on YouTube. It's the thing I've made that I'm most proud of. It's a personal project, so I'm very hyped about showing that one to people.
And wait, what is it called again? What's the title?
It's called The New Harvey House, a Unreal 5 descent into the Anthropocene.
Wow. Okay, I'm going to check that out. That sounds awesome. And how recent is that? How new is that?
I did that last year.
Okay.
Yeah, last year. I had worked on it for a couple years, but it was a crazy project. 'Cause, like, I green screens myself into the scene. Like I said, I did the music presentation. There's a lot of architectural discussion. In that one, I was going for brutalist architecture, so not as classical, right? Like for all my classical architecture purists out there, this project is kind of sacrilegious, right? Because it's full modern, like almost no detail. But I love them both. I love modern and classical. So
yeah, that's awesome. Okay, I'll definitely check that out. That sounds cool. The New Harvey House.
Yes.
Got it. Okay. All right. Well, then I'm going to do the outro here. That wraps up this event for tonight. Thank you, Josh, so much for joining us and sharing about your career pathway and the advice and the tips. And it was really cool. And thanks to everyone who joined us on the stream tonight. And as a reminder, Gnomon hosts monthly industry events on our campus and live stream channels like this. So be sure to follow us on social media, whether it's like Facebook, Twitch, or YouTube. That's where all this stuff is being streamed. And join our mailing list to stay up to date on our event schedule. This is our final event for the year, but we have a lot of exciting things planned for 2026. So be sure to follow us on the socials so you don't miss out. And you can always connect with us, with our admissions team, if you are interested in enrolling in a full-time program or signing up for some individual courses. Best way to do that is by sending an email to admissions@gnomon.edu. admissions@gnomon.edu. Thanks again, Josh, for joining us and doing this awesome presentation. Thanks to everyone for watching. And until next time, good night and have a great holiday break. See everyone in 2026.
Thanks
again,
everyone.
Josh.
Take care.
All right. See you, everybody.